Right, so good evening and welcome to our Bible study. Let us begin by praying. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you speak. We thank you that you speak through the written word. We thank you that you speak as the living word in our hearts and lives. And so, Lord, as we gather around your word tonight, to read it and reflect on it, to delve a little bit deeper into it, I pray, Lord, that you would speak to us. Amen.
Amen.
Right. Looking at John chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. Interestingly, this is one of the few miracles that occurs in all of the Gospels. Very often Matthew, Mark, and Luke will have miracles that John doesn't have. And sometimes only one or two of the other Gospels will share a miracle, but the feeding of the 5,000 goes across all of them. So reading John chapter 6 and going from verses 1 to 15. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing those who were ill. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will that go among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Right. Word of God to us tonight. So start looking through what we have in the text. We're told sometime after this, so it's not a clear time frame. And John was putting his story together to convey the theology he was trying to communicate. And John's gospel is particularly strong on sort of focusing on the theology of who Jesus is and what he does, rather than just telling the stories of his life. Clearly some time had elapsed, and exactly how it happened, we don't know. But Jesus was now up north at the Sea of Galilee. In chapter 5, he'd been in Jerusalem. And John says, we'd pick up the story later on. And we always need to remember that the Gospels are not written in the 20th or 21st century. They're not biographies as we have today. where people are quite clear on getting the chronology right and putting the relevant geographical details in of how people traveled. That wasn't the aim of the writers. John wanted to pick up this story of Jesus, and so we just pick it up that we're up north on the far shore, across to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. The Sea of Galilee was also known as the Sea of Tiberias in the first century. And John is one of the only writers that makes this connection, quite possibly writing later on. We believe that the John's Gospel was probably the last one written. And so there's quite a big Gentile community within the church. And John, being aware of this, would include the Roman name for the Sea of Galilee, because it was named after Tiberius Caesar. Herod had completed building the town of Tiberias on the southwestern shore of the lake. And so that the lake ended up being named after that town. And it is done because of the Caesar to win favor with Rome. And so John includes that in his story. And they're up there, and it's quite near Bethsaida in the north of the Lake of Galilee. We're told a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he performed by healing those who were ill. And just John notes that the people followed because of the signs. They weren't following Jesus because he was a great teacher. They were following because of the miracles he was doing. And quite likely, they missed the import of what he was doing by sort of focusing on the miracles and not thinking beyond that. And John, as he records the miracles, he records them as signs. Jesus performed these signs which all point to who he is. John saw it. The crowds didn't. They just saw the healing, the deliverance, and in today's story, the bread. Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. It's not clear which mountain it was. Quite possibly the Greek that they translate as a mountainside could mean the hill country or high ground. And so it might not necessarily be referring to a single specific mountain, but could be referring just to the hill country. And quite possibly might have been the high country to the east of the Sea of Galilee, which today is known as the Golan Heights. And so Jesus was up in that part of the world. And John continues and just positions this in terms of timing, and he says the Jewish Passover festival was near, which is wonderful that he includes it, but then it just raises all sorts of issues as you work through, because in chapter 5, we're told that Jesus had gone up to the feast, and it wasn't quite clear what the feast was, quite likely the Feast of Pentecost. And therefore, between chapter 5 and chapter 6, quite a lot of time has passed already, because if the Passover festival was near, it means that it was the following year already. And so the Pentecost would have been in AD 31, that Jesus was in Jerusalem, and now it's the Passover of AD 32 was upon them, and it was probably just a year before Jesus' crucifixion, because it wasn't this Passover, but the next one that Jesus was crucified. So John positions the story in the north with the crowds and quite close to Passover. And when Jesus looks up and he sees this great crowd coming towards him, he says to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He turns to Philip because we're told in John's Gospel that Philip was from the town of Bethsaida. Bethsaida is in that area. And so if he'd approached one of the other disciples, they would have said, we don't know. Whereas Philip, being from Bethsaida, would have known the area, would have known the towns round about there. And so he would have been the one of the disciples that would have been able to say where you would be able to get bread to feed a crowd, or which towns would you go to, possibly which has the biggest bakeries or whatever. And so this is Philip's country. It wasn't just some kind of arbitrary question that Jesus dumped on one of the disciples. This was Philip's home ground. And so he, of all the disciples, would know where to get supplies. And so Jesus asks this of him. And John then makes this little aside almost in verse 6. He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So Jesus challenges Philip's thinking, but Jesus isn't asking out of a sense of desperation or that he's got no options. He knows exactly what's going to happen, how he's going to feed the crowd. And he's testing Philip. Not sure exactly what the test it was, other than to see if Philip would rely on Jesus. And Philip answers quite sensibly. It would take more than half a year's wages. The Greek had that it would take 200 denarii. And the denarius was a silver coin worth about a day's wage for a laborer. And so in that time, if you worked for a day, you'd get a denarius. So 200 denarii was a fair amount of money, so about 8 months' pay. And so Philip's rough estimate had taken half a year's wages to buy was right, to be a real challenge to feed this number of people because they didn't have the resources. Jesus didn't go around with lots of money in his back pocket. There's a story where some of the people come and challenge Peter and say, doesn't Jesus pay the temple tax? And Jesus doesn't whip out a coin from his money belt. He sends Peter to go and catch fish. And the fish he catches has got sufficient money in its mouth to pay for Jesus and Peter's temple tax. So Philip looking and saying, it's going to take 200 denarii to feed this crowd. They didn't have the resources. And therefore, essentially, he's saying, we can't feed them. We can't feed these people. And John's little claim in verse 6 that he is testing him means that Jesus wasn't unaware of the fact that this was a huge crowd, that they didn't have the resources, that this wasn't going to be something that they could do. There was no human solution to the problem that they confronted here. But Jesus was quite happy to confront the problem. And it's just interesting that he confronts the problem, and so often many people, and I put my hand up as one of those, are often quite happy to walk away from a problem that we think can't be solved. And Jesus could quite easily have just done the teaching and then said farewell and gone his own way. He wasn't in any way expected to feed everybody. But we know that his care for people was what prompted it. And one of the other Gospels say that he said, it's a lonely place, we're far from people, we don't want them to faint and struggle to get home again. So we do need to feed them. So Philip says, this is something we can't do. There is no answer to this. Andrew, in verse 8, has a different approach. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, speaks up and says, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. And Andrew was a disciple that brought people to Jesus. Right at the very beginning, Andrew was one of the people, a disciple of John, John had pointed Jesus out to him. He'd spent the day with Jesus, and he then went and told Simon, we've found the Messiah, and he brought Simon to Jesus. At another point, some Greeks come to Philip and say, we want to see Jesus. And Philip then goes to Andrew, and Andrew brings Philip and the Greek people to meet Jesus. So Andrew was constantly bringing people to Jesus. Sometimes that's all we can do, is to bring people to Jesus. We've got a problem, we can't solve it, but we can bring people to Jesus and introduce them. And Andrew comes with a small boy, or a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. Quite likely the boy heading off had taken provisions with him that he would have lunch. This was his lunch that he had: 5 small barley loaves, 2 fish. One of the commentators was saying that this was most likely pickled fish, because fresh fish would go off very quickly in the heat of the area, and so very few people would eat fresh fish. But if you pickled the fish, it would last. And so it was most likely pickled fish that the boy had with his barley loaves. And it's also that John making a note of the fact that it was barley was highlighting the fact that this was not a particularly well-off young boy, because barley bread was considered the food of the poor. The better off would eat wheat bread. The poorer folk would eat barley. And so here was this young boy without huge resources to back him up, without little in his hand, but he comes and Jesus offers what he has to Jesus. Andrew comes with him and he says, here's this boy, this is what he's got, but how far will that go among so many? And I can feel for him. There have been a couple of times where organizing something and you're making arranged hot dogs, and you've got 24 hot dogs, and you'd assume that there were going to be 18 people, and you thought this was well catered, and next thing there's 20 people, and then 22, and then 25, and you've got 30 people, and you've only got, you've got 24 hot dogs, and you're thinking, how's this going to work? And that is exactly where Andrew was. We've got a little bit, but it's insignificant in confronting the situation that we're up against. Jesus is sort of quite calm, just says, make the people sit down. One of the other gospels say that he gets him to sit down in groups of 50, get the people into groups and get them to sit down. And John adds the comment, there was plenty of grass in that place. And they sat down. And it's interesting that he adds that fact that there was plenty of grass there, because that fact adds nothing to the story. It's not picked up on, that Jesus doesn't suddenly start mentioning grass and fodder or anything. It's just sort of, and a number of people have pointed out that this is the kind of comment that an eyewitness would have made. Jesus comes and says, get everybody to sit down, and there's plenty of grass over where everybody sat down. And so it's one of those things that just underscores the eyewitness accounts that we're dealing with. And they all sit down, about 5,000 men. Again, it's in a patriarchal society, it was, people would have counted the men, and there were women and children with them, but they wouldn't have been part of the numbering of the crowd. And it's almost as though everybody assumed that if a man's there, there would be a woman there and probably a couple of children. And so if you knew the number of men, you had an idea of the size of the total crowd. And so we're probably talking 10, 15,000 people gathered around Jesus. And he takes the loaves gives thanks, which is exactly what man would do at the start of a meal. Give thanks to God, say thank you for the food that you give us. Thank you for the grain that has been given in its basic standard Jewish mealtime grace that Jesus gives. And he breaks them and gives it to his disciples to distribute to those who are seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish, gave thanks and distributed it. And sort of these 5 small loaves and 2 fish are multiplied and serve the crowd. And there are a number of commentators who struggle with the miraculous and say that this is impossible. 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish can't feed 10,000 people. It's impossible. So they look for some other explanation. And 2 explanations that are given. The one which I've mentioned before is that some people say, well, because this crowd was probably traveling, they were quite likely, because it was getting towards the Passover festival, they might well have been on their way to Jerusalem and made a detour to see this Jesus. But if they were heading to Jerusalem, they would have had their supplies with them. It's also, they say, quite likely that if they're going off into a more remote place, they wouldn't have just wandered off in there with nothing. Today, if people go off like that, you take your cell phone with you, you take something. And so people might well have had supplies, and they just didn't want to share them. So the miracle was that Jesus got this crowd of people to share their food, and they went from being individualists looking after themselves to loving part of the community, helping to look after everyone, which may well be true, but that would rather make it not so much of a miracle. That would have made it a bit more of an inspirational story of what happens if everybody shares. And John would be unlikely to have included it as a sign that points to who Jesus is. So for me, that doesn't really carry much weight. The other explanation that one of the commentators said is that quite possibly John, because he goes in the next chapter to talk about Jesus teaching, I am the bread of life, which replaces the story of the Last Supper. John doesn't have the Last Supper in his gospel. Therefore, maybe what this was a symbolic meal, like we have the symbolism of the Eucharist, where people have a small little wafer or small piece of bread and a sip of wine to represent all that you're having. And they say maybe that was what happened, that they took and they gave everybody just a tiny little bit. And so they ate ceremoniously, or they ate in some kind of semi-liturgical way. Again, I think that's trying to sort of find excuses where they aren't really necessary, because that then just doesn't make sense of John saying and distribute it to those who are seated as much as they wanted. And if the point was that nobody was greedy and everybody was of one spirit and just having this little bit, then John would have made that point far more clearly. Whereas what I read here is that the hungry were fed. If they were hungry, they took a great big chunk of bread and 3/4 of a fish, and they were satisfied. And if one, in my perspective, if one believes that God is real and that God is God, that God created the universe, God made the universe where loaves of bread don't just multiply like this, and 2 fishes can't feed 5,000. That's the universe he's created. Because he's the creator of the universe, he can do things differently. He can make things work and happen that are completely out of the ordinary, that there is no other explanation for it. And when Jesus does that, that does point to who he is. That does point to him being God incarnate. That does point to him being more than just another man, or a great teacher, or a great leader, or more than even just a ritualistic healer of the day. Here is somebody that was completely remarkable in every respect. In the next chapter, he calms the storms, which is impossible. In this chapter, he takes a small amount of food and can feed thousands. No one else can do that. But that reveals who Jesus is. And so the disciples distributed. And when they'd all had enough to eat, again, that's not just a tiny little symbolic smidgen of food. They've had enough to eat. They've had their full. And he then says to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. And somebody suggested that in the first century, it was polite when you're having a meal, particularly not at home, but elsewhere, that you wouldn't finish everything. You would leave a little bit of the bread and stuff so that the servants of the house could then take that and eat it. And so it might have been part of the thinking that the people would have and leave some for the servants, because that was their habit. Whether that's what happened or not, or whether there were just crumbs left over and people had taken a whole big chunk and realized that it was more than they needed, there was food left over, and the disciples went and gathered them. And we're told they gathered and filled 12 baskets. And if they're 12 disciples, 12 apostles, they probably each would have a basket. And again, one of the commentators says that Jews would very often have a basket for food, because if they're going on a journey or going somewhere, to keep the dietary requirements, to keep kosher, they couldn't trust that they'd get kosher food where they were going. And so they'd have a basket with food in it they would take with them to make sure that they didn't make themselves unclean by what they ate. And so the suggestion was that each of the disciples would have had a basket like that. And again, whether that is the true account of what's going on, I don't know, but it does make sense. And so each of the disciples goes out with his basket and fills his basket with leftover pieces. And says that he picked up pieces of the 5 barley loaves. And as I was preparing, just suddenly noticed, had my attention drawn to the fact that they picked up pieces of barley loaves, but not pieces of fish. And again, quite likely because the fish would not last quite as well as the barley loaves. If you have some barley loaves, you don't have to, you can just put it in the basket and it'll be fine. Fish, not so. And so quite possibly sort of accounts for the fact that they only picked up the barley loaves. And again, John's focusing on the bread, because in the next chapter, he goes on to talk about Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. They that come to me shall not hunger. And so there's bread given. Jesus provides the bread, and there's more than enough bread, and there's bread left over. And what Jesus gives and provides, and what Jesus does for us, is more than we would need. He is more than sufficient to our needs. And so the disciples go and they pick up these 12 baskets. It's just recorded, and we're not told what they did with it, whether they lived off that for the next 2 weeks or what happened, we don't know. Just that they picked up, which highlights the abundance when God provides. And after the people, we're told in verse 14, saw the sign Jesus performed. Yeah, John is quite clear. This is a sign that the people recognized. And again, if it was just Jesus encouraged us to share our sandwiches, I don't think the people would have thought, what a wonderful sign. This must have been the miraculous feeding. and they say, this Jesus, this teacher, this person is remarkable. Surely, they say, this is the prophet who is to come into the world. And the prophet, that's a reference back to Deuteronomy chapter 18, where God says, I will raise up a prophet like Moses. And by Jesus' day, that promise of a prophet like Moses had become one of the hopes of the nation. It was that would lead into the coming of the Messiah. This prophet would come and then lead the Messiah in after him. And so there was this eschatological figure amongst the people, the prophet. And Jesus was aware that they would likely come, verse 15, Jesus, they intended to come and make him king by force. Say, you are the one, clearly, and they would put him on the throne, which would have undone all sorts of things. It would have provoked Herod's response. It would have got the Romans to come in force. It was a totally bad idea, and therefore Jesus would have none of it, and because he was very clear what his mission was, what he'd come to do, what his role was, what the Father was leading him to, and he was focused on that. And so when people want to come and do something that will move him away from his ministry and what his role, he gets out of there. They wanted to do it, and instead Jesus withdrew again to a mountain by himself. He disappears. And the fact that he went by himself suggests that not even the disciples were with him, and John doesn't know where he went. He just went off to a mountain by himself, but he wasn't going to be at the calling and the desire of the crowd. So Jesus waits his time. And if you read through the Gospels time again, he says, the hour has not come. Now is not the hour, until he finally gets to Gethsemane. And he says, now watch and pray. Right, so John chapter 6 and John's version of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000.